Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we're going to actually talk about the debate between controller versus keyboard and mouse. And this is a little bit of a different debate than console or PC. Obviously, PC statistically will always have slight advantages over console. Frame rate, field of view, at least until that changes on COD or unless next gen games catch up. The specific debate here is controller versus keyboard and mouse, regardless if you're on a console or if you're on a PC. I've been experimenting a lot more with keyboard and mouse and getting a little bit more comfortable in the game. These are some of my first matches you're going to see here. I was playing with the decked out squad that are pretty comfortable, so I can get a little bit more practice in. We ended up winning 8 out of 9 matches, and that's kind of some of the gameplay you're going to see in the background. So we're going to talk about various topics. Go ahead and feel free to chime in the comments section, give your opinion, because obviously when it comes to this topic, people are very vocal. If you enjoyed the video or learned something new, please do me a favor, hit that like button. If you're brand new, looking to find your way back, just double check, make sure you subscribe with notifications on. In addition to talking about some of those different things, I'll talk about whether or not I think if you're on controller, you should make the switch to keyboard and mouse, or if you're on keyboard and mouse, you should make the switch to controller in terms of Warzone. Obviously, there's people on both ends of the spectrum. They're either good, bad, or indifferent, somewhere in the middle, and we'll kind of walk through that particular process. Personally, there's a lot of pros and cons to each individual peripheral. If you go with the controller, obviously you have aim assist, and there's different various options on aim assist. Sometimes it's strong, sometimes it's weak, sometimes it completely disappears, depending on what part of the map you're on. So one of the biggest issues with the controller is you're going to have a little bit of inconsistency in terms of how strong aim assist works, and that's kind of like an artificial help that the game gives you that you're not really in control of. So it kind of limits how good or how bad you are, because it's always there trying to help you and close the skill gap a little bit. And when it comes to keyboard and mouse, you have the option to have different keybinds. It's all your user input. So if you don't aim correctly, you miss your shots. If you input the wrong keys on your keybinds, then you end up doing the wrong movement. It's 100% on you, which kind of broadens the skill gap because of that reason. Lower tier keyboard and mouse players are probably going to be worse than lower tier controller players, but the top tier keyboard and mouse will generally be better than the top tier controller players, because there's kind of like a threshold of how good you can get on a particular platform, and keyboard and mouse, that range is just wider, both on the lower skilled and both on the above average. A lot of people assume, hey, you know what, controller player, you know, they're just kind of a casual player. Yes, but there are a lot of people that are very uncomfortable using keyboard and mouse. I know when I barely started getting into it, it was a little bit difficult. I'm like looking down, pressing the right button to plate, all those types of things. And in those moments, I am a worse player than I am on controller, but over time I'm going to become better and more comfortable, and that's what ends up happening. There's people that are barely starting out and their learning curve is very slow, so it takes them a long time to kind of bridge up, whereas controller ease of use, very simple inputs, and there's different options. Obviously you can have paddles on the back, you can play claw, there's different things you can do to close the gap in terms of even the number of buttons you can press. But in terms of accuracy, you end up with that issue where how consistent can you be when using the weapons? Obviously, there are some weapons that perform a little bit better in certain scenarios. Obviously, pistols generally favor controller players because of the aim assist kicks in. But generally with snipers, keyboard and mouse generally have the advantage, just because they can have a lot more precision with how they move and how they can literally just flick to somebody's head. So that switching targets, there's a lot of advantage with that. But obviously, as you get closer, aim assist does a lot of work, not all of it, because obviously there's still terrible players that don't know how to control their guns and know how to line up their shots. Even with all the aim assist in the world, it just doesn't do it. And then a lot of the guns in between, whether you're using rifles, SMGs, those are fairly balanced, usually closer depending on, you know, how the person's going to move. It can be a little bit easier, or at least more forgiving on a controller, because you can be a little bit sloppy and the aim assist will still, for the most part, allow you to be relatively consistent as long as it's working. Keyboard and mouse, you don't get a safety net. If you're not lining up that shot and you're not shooting appropriately, you're going to miss a ton of shots and it's going to put you at a disadvantage. Kind of circling back around to consistency, it's generally going to be easier to be more consistent when you're tracking, as well as when you're just generally aiming with a controller, but there can be a little bit of precision loss, especially at range, whereas somebody who is on keyboard and mouse and practices those things are going to be able to outperform that controller player even on the top end, just because they have much greater control, especially if their sensitivity DPI is dialed in. They can just move correctly and adjust it perfectly to match that recoil, especially in this game where it doesn't have a ton of recoil. I think it's intentionally built where there's not a lot of recoil on the vast majority of guns, so that controller players can stay relatively competitive to keyboard and mouse. Whereas in other games like PUBG or CSGO or Valorant, there's way more recoil on certain options where you would literally have to drag your entire arm, and the controller players just would not be able to keep up unless their sensitivity was incredibly high, but then they'd be incredibly inaccurate. They'd have to bump up aim assist, which would completely break the game. So there's a lot of other issues there that COD sticks to a lower recoil kind of business model where it just makes it a little bit more user friendly. So when people get started, the game helps them out considerably with aim assist, especially on controller. One of the biggest differences I have found with controller versus keyboard and mouse is there are way more options to improve your aim with keyboard and mouse. There's different things like Kovacs, Aim Labs, which is free on Steam, that I've been doing a lot of, and my scores have continued to improve. I'm not God tier or anything like that, but they've continued to improve, and I see progress over time. You could plug in a controller, but it's just going to be a little bit awkward. The actual games and systems are not really set up for controller players. Everything is really in-game. Go play bots. You know, you got to get used to the aim assist, figure out your sensitivity. It's all important, but that is really your only method. With the keyboard and mouse, I could probably look up a dozen other apps that'll help me with aim. There's different exercises I can do. Within those programs, there's a huge resource on different exercises I can do, whether it's for tracking, flicking, how fast I'm snapping on targets, the accuracy. There's a lot of the precision, paying attention to when you spot targets. There's so much stuff that's just not available to a controller player. And I think that's where the skill gap gets spread out much further, because a lot of keyboard and mouse games are built with the keyboard and mouse player in mind. So these things are strategically built to help those players, and controller players just do not have that option. And I feel like even with my little time that I have played on keyboard and mouse and doing these exercises and then playing in Warzone and then doing Plunder and mixing things up, maybe even jumping in multiplayer so I can get that experience, the amount of gains I'm getting on keyboard and mouse is significantly higher. And even some of the things I'm working on translate to controller once I switch over, because I'm relearning fundamentals on how to improve as a player. Versus controller, you got to do a little bit differently within your sensitivity and within the aim assist boundaries and what weapon you're using. There's a lot of variables, but I think that's where the huge advantage comes in from keyboard and mouse, is there's a lot of tools to improve versus typically with controller. If you kind of suck with your aim and you can't find the right sensitivity, you're kind of screwed. There's not a lot of tools out there other than load up bots, play with bots. Obviously, there's things like Control Freaks, which I use on pretty much all my controllers I've ever used since I started using them several years ago. But even that has a limitation compared to a full arm with the right sensitivity and DPI. It will never be able to compete once you get to the top end level of what you're capable of doing. So those are all little parts of it. Another thing is, since this is Call of Duty, obviously you don't necessarily need to have high flicks or anything like that. It's very rare that you get shot in the back and you have to be able to do a 180. I mean, I don't know what happens. You get shot in the back, third partied, whatever. It's Warzone. But it's very rare that you being able to just snap on that target with your arm would be enough to save you, especially with how fast the time to kill is in the game. So positioning is still always key. If I'm head to head and I'm keyboard and mouse or controller, regardless of what the enemy is using, keyboard and mouse controller, positioning is still like number one. If I have the high ground and I'm on a good head glitch and I can peek over and see them and I'm controlling the gunfight, they're rotating in, they have to be in a full-on sprint. That gives me all the power. Vice versa, if I have to run in and they have the power position. So positioning is still key. So at the end of the day, when you're playing Warzone, it's incredibly close in terms of head-to-head because of the way the game mechanics work. positioning can still outplay the absolute best keyboard and mouse player. On top of that, at the end of the day, it's Call of Duty. So Call of Duty has always been geared more towards controller players. That's what they've supported on console. And then with this year, or Modern Warfare's year, they did crossplay. They've added that in, and it introduced a lot of other dynamics. It literally saved the PC keyboard and mouse community, which normally dies off within a few months, and the lobbies are pretty much 12 players, and it's always the same 12 players after a couple months of the game's release. Modern Warfare, that didn't happen because of crossplay. Controller players decided to switch over, take advantage of those, because obviously you're kind of forced. Hey, you got the option between the both. You might as well go with more frames and better FOV, because that's what you're going to get from it, and you don't have to give up the controller. Even though when it comes to controller console versus controller PC, you get the same amount of aim assists. There's obviously just areas that you lose aim assists, and that's something you're always going to have to deal with. So personally, I feel like I've spent the past decade on controller, so I'm very comfortable with that. I don't have any issues with using a controller, going up in any engagement, feeling comfortable with a controller. Since keyboard and mouse is still very new for me, like a month, I've been trying to really work on different things. I've gotten more comfortable. But what has been a little bit different is normally when I play Warzone, or even when I was playing multiplayer, if I go on a long streak, you know how you get a little bit nervous or whatever? I stop getting nervous when it comes to controller play, just because I'm so comfortable. I'm not worried about making a mistake. I'm more worried about, hey, something bad's going to happen. I get third partied. I get exploded by a double nade or something. A RCXD comes out and blows me up. Whatever it is, I just don't really get those nervousness because I'm very comfortable with what I'm doing. From playing keyboard and mouse, anytime those tense situations pop up, you get that little bit of adrenaline rush. And I'm sure if you were on keyboard and mouse and then you were switching to controller that you were very uncomfortable with, you'd probably still be decent at it, just because controllers are just generally easier to use. Like I talked about, it closes that skill gap. So top players are still top players, bad players are still bad players, but it's just not as bad as someone who's bad on PC, and not good as somebody is good on PC with keyboard and mouse. So I actually would get into those situations where I'm like, boom, you know, you get that adrenaline rush. You're worried about hitting your shots, aiming, positioning, controller movement on your keybinds, making sure you played up. You call in a UAV, you're moving around, you're positioning, you're crouching, you go prone. There's so much you got to worry about intensely. And I think at the end of the day, probably in 6 months from now, I'm still going to continue using both, just because I think it helps me to better understand both platforms a little bit better, or peripherals. But I think the opportunity is just going to be stronger on keyboard and mouse. So that's what I plan to just invest a little bit more time in. It allows me to diversify into other first-person shooters that are only keyboard and mouse. So if you were thinking of switching from keyboard and mouse to controller, I'd say that's perfectly fine. You know, if you feel like you just want to have a little bit more laid-back approach, sometimes you just won't want to have to like be sweating. That's what I noticed too. You know, your posture's different when you're on keyboard and mouse. Maybe you don't want to do that, and maybe you just want to sit back and relax. There's some days where maybe I just want to sit back and relax. I could just do it controller because I'm very comfortable with that. Versus if I want to really, you know, get better and significantly better and reach a ceiling that has not been capable for me on controller, keyboard and mouse is going to be the way to go. If you're on controller and you're contemplating switching, it is rough. You're going to be terrible. You're going to make tons of mistakes. Hopefully you're comfortable putting in the time that's going to allow you to reach that level. Several months ago, I considered switching keyboard and mouse, and I was just like, I don't have the time to invest in that the way I want. And things now, I have a little bit more time to actually play the game, grind it out, even though a lot of the testing's happened recently with all the broken attachments. I have a little bit more time in getting comfortable using this when I go to a buy station, how my movement works, dropping plates and money, looking at the map. You know, there's a lot of different things you're going to have to take time. And if you're really looking to improve and reach the next level, you can get a keyboard and mouse on console. It'll be a little bit wonky in terms of being able to get the frames, because frames are terrible on console. You have the opportunity to go to PC. Warzone's free to play, so you might as well try it that way. But either way, I think you can reach a higher ceiling on keyboard and mouse, but you can still reach a pretty high level on controller and be comfortable with that. So that's my general thoughts on it. You know, I've given a little bit more time, so I thought I'd give my kind of overall thoughts, since a lot of people do ask me, hey, what do you recommend? What are some of your tips? If you're switching to keyboard and mouse, I would try and use all the different tools available to you, whether it's an aim trainer of some kind like Kovacs or Aim Labs. There's plenty more out there, I'm sure. Just as long as you're getting started, you commit to it, you're comfortable, realizing that you'll probably suck if you're switching from controller to keyboard and mouse, or vice versa. It's just part of the process, and then eventually you're gonna hit that, that stride where hey, you know what? I feel much better than I was on controller JGOD, or I'm much better on controller than I am on keyboard and mouse JGOD. So it's kind of one of those things. Hopefully you guys did enjoy the video, learned something new. If you did, please do me a favor, hit that like button. If you're brand new, want to find your way back, double check, make sure you subscribe with notifications on. I do appreciate all the support on the channel. Thank you for watching. As always, have a great day.